why did Paul try to save the French soldier? In my opinion, the reason why Paul tried to save the French soldier was because was it a better fate for Paul to die at the end, or was it a better fate for him to stay alive and keep moving forward, despite the fact that he had at that point lost everything? Hey, man, you're back to the Shade Cinema podcast. My name's Chris, in case you forgot, and today we will be analyzing the very hit and successful movie called All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a German war movie that's during the First World War, and it's based on the German side, which is it's a very interesting perspective to look at. I'll give my opinion on the movie in a little bit, but before we actually start the video, I'm going to ask you guys to leave a like. I fixed it, it's not that loud anymore, and subscribe to the channel.
Ballsy.
If you haven't. Though I'm pretty sure at this point you've already liked, because you are an absolute beast. You're an absolute beast, sir. So the movie is based in World War One. It's about this guy. It follows the story of this guy named Paul. He's a German soldier who joined in around 1917, so near the tail end of the war. And it talks about his journey, and it skips a bunch of time. Like, it just jumps 18 months to near the end of the war, like in November 1918. And in November 1918, that's around the time the war ended. That's actually when the war ended, and on the 11th. And the movie starts off around the 7th of November, I think. And Paul, he's basically a soldier, and he's going through all this thing. And it's not really like the movie, although being like a war movie, is not really a war movie. It's more of like an anti-war movie. It's really the only war movie that's a proper anti-war movie, because there's no glorification of war here. There's no, like, by glorification I mean there's no like big charge. You know, if you watch Saving Private Ryan, there's like a whole action sequence and there's a good guy and a bad guy involved. Here there's not really any bad guys on the field. They're all like relatively gray, and the real bad guys are the guys at all the way in the back of the front lines. And it kind of paints this broad picture about soldiers and how they're kind of, I guess, forced to be a part of this needless war. And it follows their journey. And one of the things I think that I noticed was about the film was the music in the movie. The whole movie is kind of followed by this somber, sad music. So, for example, there's a part in the movie where Paul and his gang, his squad, right, are all chilling by, like, at some camp. And they're eating food, and like they just killed like a goose or whatever, and like they caught a goose like they stole a goose from like a French farmer, and then they brought it back and they killed it, and then, you know, they have like they're eating this goose, and then the whole time there's like this sad, somber music, even though it's like a happy moment. There's like, it's just filled with sadness around, right? It's kind of like when you're sad because, you know, someone passed away in your family, or someone you know passed away, but you're trying to fill up like your heart and your soul with some form of happiness, if that makes any sense. Like you're trying to fill up that hole, and you're trying to be happy, and you're experiencing happy things, like you're watching a comedy show by Kevin Hart or Chris Rock or whoever, and you know they're making you laugh, but like once you're out of that scenario, you're back into kind of like a shitty zone, into a shitty mood that you're in. And that's kind of what the movie is like. And the whole movie has like an instance of like this heavy music. And also, one of the things like a lot of people noticed in the movie, obviously because it's like prevalent, is one of the sound effects during like that soundtrack, which actually goes like this. I put it on my soundboards. It goes like. And what I think, I don't know if I came up with it or a friend of mine came up with it, but I'll credit my friend Auden, who's been on the show many times. He said that music is like as if there's some sort of danger approaching. And I think I replied and said, like, yeah, it's a danger approaching, but it's a danger that's approaching that they know. It's kind of like when you're anticipating on going out on a date and you're really nervous because like obviously it's probably a girl that you really like, or you're getting ready for a big game, a game that's going to really decide like your future in whatever sport that is, right? Like there's a scout watching your game, and it's kind of like that sound, like this sound. It's like that danger is approaching you as you're getting closer, and the closer and closer they get to the danger and to the big event, to the big the big anticipating event, the closer and closer they get to it, the faster and faster it goes. So it goes like, then it goes again, then it goes again. It goes faster and faster, and it's like an anticipation of that danger. But there were moments where in the movie where there were dangerous moments that were followed by nothing just because of the surprise that came with it. I set up a series of questions for me to answer because those were like some of the things I thought about when watching the movie, which was like, why did these young men go to war? Like war, now we look at it and it's like pretty horrible. Yeah, we play war in like a Call of Duty game or whatever, but we don't want to experience war. War is a terrible thing and everyone knows that. But back then, war wasn't seen as something that's so kind of fucked up. It was always seen as something that was relatively glorious, because wars at that point in time, especially in the 1800s, like the last really big war was the Napoleonic War, which is like 100 years before this war. So they didn't really have a concept of what was a really long war. You had the Austro-Prussian War, which was like 6 months. You had the Franco-Prussian War, which was about like a year, maybe a year and a half. Not even. Like I think it went from 1870 to 1871, but I don't think it was actually a year. It was like within that. Anyways, the whole point being is that the wars were not very long. So having a war that's this long was something that was like almost unfathomable. But there was still that mentality of, this is like a glorious thing to fight for. It's a glorious thing to fight for your country. And it is, depending on the situation. But in this situation, especially if you're German, you're the attacking force. You're not getting invaded by anybody. You're the aggressor. So it's a lot more difficult for these soldiers to head on into the fight. What does the German government do? The German government says that they have to do it for the fatherland, for whatever, and they instill this great like patriotic and nationalistic fervor into the youth of the country. And what that does is that magnifies and amplifies that vigor within the youth. The youth are very hopeful people. The youth have a lot of energy and a lot of hopes and dreams, and that hope is one of the biggest things that was discussed in this movie, or at least implied in this movie. I found that when there was a lot of instances where Paul tried to find hope in a hopeless situation, and even though it was very, very difficult, he tried to find that little glimmer of light in the darkness. And I'll discuss what happens to Paul later on. At the beginning of the movie, Paul and all of his friends are all very excited to go join up and go enlist in the army, even though Paul's parents told him, like, don't do that, that's stupid, you're gonna die. And he doesn't care, he's gonna do it anyway. So he goes and does it, and as the recruitment people are coming in, and he's like, you're doing great for Germany, you're doing it for your fatherland and for freedom or whatever. And then they get shipped off to war, and they're all very excited and all that stuff. And they get to the front, and 5 minutes into being in the front, maybe 5-10 minutes or whatever, however long it takes them to get to the frontline trenches, they have to like scoop out fucking water from their trenches because their trenches are being flooded. And like the soldiers are starting to really already not like it, They finally get hit in the face with the reality of what's it like to be at war. So these young men go to war because they believe in the idea of defending their nation. They believe in the ideas of maintaining the freedom and the prosperity of their nation. It's also about something that I talked about beforehand in the Downfall episode, which was the other solo episode that I did, where I talked about how it's all about being a part of this group. People want to join this group and they want to be known as a soldier. Men kind of I'm going to kind of divert a little bit, but like men kind of like having status, right? I think every guy has thought about, what if I was a soldier? Even though it's not something that's like necessarily something that we actually want to do, but we think about it for like a second. Oh, how cool would it be to be a soldier? But then you think about, going to war and dying, and you're like, no, I'd rather not. It's something I think that's intrinsic within guys. A lot of guys, go to war because it's something to do with status, or it's something for them, it was about adventure. Also, one of the reasons why these soldiers went to war, these young men decided like, okay, let's pack up our shit, let's go to the front line and fight the French, was because they were kind of lied to. Actually, they were very, very, very much lied to. The German politicians in the high command basically said, oh, we're going to have this big offensive and it's going to end in like a few short weeks. Keep in mind the verbiage. A few short weeks, it'll be done. And then we'll be in Paris. We're going to be eating cheese and drinking wine and eating baguette, whatever the fuck. And we're going to have a jolly old fucking time. Now, here's the thing. All that was...
Stop the cap.
That was fucking cap. The generals knew it was cap. The politicians knew it was cap because they were nowhere fucking near Paris at that point in time. And there was no fucking chance that they were ever going to be able to reach that point in 1917 when these soldiers enlisted into the German army. So they were lied to. So they thought it was just going to be some quick adventure. So they hop on to the enlistment. They go in, they get enlisted, and then next thing you know, one of them gets fucking obliterated by an artillery shell in like the first 30 minutes of his time at the front. So after a while, I discussed this before about when they were eating, the goose that they killed earlier. One of the German soldiers sees like women in the background, and he goes up to the women and he starts chatting up with them. And then leaves and then comes back like that night. And he brings like, I don't know if it's panties or something else. He brings some form of like underwear. And a lot of the soldiers really gravitate towards that. So my question is like, why were the panties so important? And obviously there's the obvious answer, right? These guys have been in the trenches for very, very long periods of time. For like 18 months at least. Paul has been in the trenches. Probably hasn't seen that many women in his time that were not prostitutes. So to him, it's I think, in my opinion, it's like sort of a symbol of their lost freedom. Because back in the civilian back in their civilian lives, the German soldiers were able to, go out, meet women there, get together with women, eat not bountiful, but like plenty of food, whatever food they wanted to eat that was delicious, that was not dog shit army rations, fucking turnip bread every fucking day, 3 times a day. They didn't have to deal with that shit when they were out there. And what the underwear or undergarments was kind of like a symbol of that. It was like a glimpse into that part of their lives that they no longer are able to live because they're at the front lines at this point and they have to, endure the struggle. So a while passes and there's a part of the movie where they do this big charge and they run in through and they burst through the French trenches and they take it. And then these tanks come in and the tanks blow them to fucking bits. And they're starting to retreat and shit. And Paul falls into this massive fucking shell hole. Like it's as if a fucking nuke fell in there. And there's a French soldier that tries to kill him, but he gets blown up. And then he ends up going over and stabbing the French soldier. The French soldier's there lying down and like bleeding out. Now, I skipped a lot at this point. But he was lying down and he was bleeding out. And Paul was freaking out. Paul was like freaking out and he finally realized like what was happening and he tried to save the French soldier, but the French soldier unfortunately died like, choking in his own blood because he got stabbed in the lungs. Paul tried to save him, but he failed obviously because he stabbed him a bunch of times. So my question in this case would be, why did Paul try to save the French soldier? In my opinion, the reason why Paul tried to save the French soldier was because he finally saw that soldier as a human being. You see glimpses of this, like in that same sequence, like 5 minutes beforehand. He was fighting a French soldier in the trenches and he was using his spade. And as he was about to deliver the final blow, he stops and he sees the French soldier kind of like begging to not be killed until he gets shot by another soldier. And the point being is that Paul finally saw his enemy as a human being. He didn't see the French soldier as simply an instrument of death, as an obstacle that he has to conquer. He saw it as he saw that man as a human being. And Paul, realizing this, he tried to save him because he realized that that guy is just the same as him. He's in the same situation. He suffers and goes through the same stuff that he goes through. So he tries his best to properly save him. Also, one of the things I noticed in that scene, Paul's face, like half of his face, it's a very famous picture. Half of his face is like covered in dirt, but it's not like wet dirt. It's like dried up, like green dirt. He looks like a proper monster at that point. It's like as if he's starting to lose his humanity, and he finally like cracks in that moment, and he can't stand the fact that he committed such a horrible thing. He committed such a heinous crime upon himself, of killing another man who was in the same position as he was. He saw that he had a family and everything, and that unfortunately that soldier will never be able to see his family again. And honestly, that was like one of the scenes that... Now listen, here's the thing. I don't cry for movies. This scene almost made me cry. Like, I was like literally like this close to crying. It was a hard as fuck scene to watch. And if you see the movie, it's gonna be the hardest fuck. It's probably gonna be the most traumatizing and hardest scene to watch because he's trying so desperately to save that French comrade, I guess. He got a lot of traumatic events through this war. So at this point, it's kind of like a debate. Was it a better fate to die in the war, or was it better to survive but with not much to live for? Because realistically, especially by the death of his friend, the death of his closest friend in the trenches, the one guy he really had left at that point because everyone else had died, he didn't really have much to live for. He has a lot of hopeful moments. Like I said before, there's a lot of hope in this movie. He thinks about opening a shoe shop with his friend, with Kat, and he wants to, let's open a shoe shop. Let's I'll clean. Kat's like, I'll clean up. I'll do the actual shoe shining. You can take care of the writing and the reading and stuff, because Paul could write and read and Kat couldn't. Kat eventually dies, but he's left. Paul is left in this state of like, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do afterwards? He says it at some point. He's like, I'm afraid for what's to come. Even at that point, he probably didn't think that he was gonna die. He didn't think he was gonna die at the end of the movie, like 20 seconds before the fucking armistice gets into effect. He begins to lose that faith and that hope, and the light is fully driven out of his eyes. You can see this, if you look at Paul before the time skip, like at the beginning of the movie, and then Paul right after the time skip, you can see a lot of the light in his eyes just get fully snuffed out. And then by the end of the movie, there's absolutely nothing behind his eyes. He has a complete 1,000-yard stare. He has no hope, nothing to live for. He's going to go back to a broken country where it's in complete anarchy and everything's going to be... The hyperinflation is going to kick them in their fucking asses. And he's not going to be able to find any kind of work anywhere. Here's something you can write in the comments, okay? Was it a better fate for Paul to die at the end? Or was it a better fate for him to stay alive and keep going forward, despite the fact that he had at that point lost everything? Because I think the only time he felt ever peaceful was when he knew that he was about to die. When he got stabbed in the back with that bayonet, and he walked out of that dugout and just looked up at the air and just felt peace, and then died peacefully, I guess, at that point. despite being stabbed, of course. But he died peacefully. It was the only time he actually had peace in that whole movie. At first, he had a youthful vigor and he was very excited. And for the rest of the movie, he always had a sense of tension behind him. A tension for what's to come, which is exactly what he was afraid of. Why did the field marshal refuse to capitulate? This goes back to one of the earlier things, which was like war was seen as like a glorious thing. Not only was it a glorious thing to be seen going into, but an honorable thing to fight for. It was honorable to fight for your country. It wasn't just as simple as like, oh fuck, I'm going to war, I'm about to fucking die or whatever. It wasn't like that. It was seen as like nothing's more honorable than dying in battle. Nothing's more honorable than sacrificing yourself for your country. See, here's the thing. The field marshal thought that they had sacrificed too much at that point to capitulate, to give up. He would rather go down fighting than he would go down after a surrender. He thought that people who were surrendering were cowards, but this kind of goes against the whole idea of maintaining some form of nation. If your goal is to protect your nation, if your goal is to maintain your nation's survival, sometimes what you have to do is you have to call it a day. You have to. It kind of sounds shitty. I really don't like saying this. And I really don't like the idea of surrendering. But sometimes, especially at that point in time, if you're German, you don't really have much of a choice. At that point in time in 1918, in November 1918, they were pretty much finished. The army was like a few weeks until collapse. They didn't have much left. They didn't have much resources or ammunition or food. So many people in Germany were starving to death because of a lack of food. A lot of children died in the winter of 1917 because of a lack of food. And now, at this point, he didn't want to concede defeat, even though at every metric you can see that, of course, they're going to lose. But there is a point here. Because the Germans capitulated, it led to some sort of like idea that, especially because it wasn't necessarily the idea of the generals to capitulate, it was the idea of the politicians. It was seen as some sort of stab in the back. So which leads to the whole stab in the back rumor that a lot of the right-wing political parties were trying to at least propagate during the interwar period. And that was one of the things that made Hitler rise to power. So based off of that, was the peace written by the French justified? Was it the right thing for the French to write the peace treaty the way they did? You can argue that the peace was too harsh. The terms of the treaty were too harsh on the German people, that they held a lot of resentment because of that treaty to France and to Britain and to the Allies. On the other hand, you can argue that they shouldn't have written that peace because they should have marched straight to Berlin instead of stopping and then calling it a day, basically. You can argue both, and basically what they did is they went for something in the middle, which was like, it was a really harsh treaty, but it's not like they went all the way to Berlin, because that would have cost a lot in lives and manpower. And I think to extend the war at that point would have been kind of pointless. They wanted to push, there were some generals who wanted to push the Germans all the way into Germany itself to show to their opponents that they've actually been vanquished, instead of, oh, they just gave up, or the politicians just gave up. Like, no, like it's serious. Like there are French soldiers and American soldiers in German territory now, and you've been thoroughly beaten. That would have been different. That wasn't the case here. They were still in France. They were still in Belgium. They were pushed back heavily, but like they were still in France and they were still in Belgium at this point. And they gave up at that point because the Germans were on their last legs. And I think pretty much, but the thing is, everyone was pretty much on their last legs except for the Americans who were just showing up. The British, they were pretty much finished. Not finished, but like, you know, like they were relatively war-weary at that point. The French, they had gone through, I think, quite a few mutinies at that point. Well, the Russians had already left the war. So I don't know if the peace was necessarily justified, at least the way they wrote it. I think going all the way to Berlin would have been a bit crazy because they would have dragged the war for at least like another 2 years. Because you have to think about it. They would have to go all the way through each city and whatever, but they also have to keep down any kind of like local rebellion, or because there were a lot of like social revolutions, like communist revolutions, socialist revolutions happening all over Germany at that point in time. It wasn't an issue of the German people were all collectively giving up. It was like kind of a bunch of revolutions sprung up in different cities. They were not all united. They're just a bunch of set revolutions, like one in Berlin, one in Bavaria, one in like whatever other city. I think they all popped up. The army had very little left. The Kaiser abdicated. There was nothing left for them to do. So they're like, okay, well, fuck it. We're going to call it a day. And then the French could have been like, no, we're going to march through Germany to make sure that you know for a fact that you've been beaten. And your people know for a fact that they've been beaten. They just thought that like, no, we weren't beaten. We were just stabbed in the back, because it's a huge blow to your pride. As a nation, it's a huge blow to your pride to believe that your nation lost because the other nation was better than yours. You want to say like, oh, well, this politician fucked us over. This person was a socialist, and he said like, oh, he was conspiring with the enemy to defeat Germany. Oh, this person was a Jew or whatever. It's a lot easier to just put the blame on someone else and not actually admit for the fact that, yes, your country actually did fucking lose. So I guess that's something that you can probably talk about and give your perspective on in the comment section. That's what the comments are for, down below. Do soldiers really have free will during times of war? This is something that I find very interesting, because you can kind of argue for both. You can say on one hand that soldiers do have free will. They do have free will because they're their own individual people. They can decide whether or not they want to agree to an order. Damned be the consequences. But on the other hand, you could say, well, these consequences often invite death. And at that point, it's like there's not much of a choice. It's either you do a heinous act, which in this case was charging into the enemy trench 15 minutes before armistice, or death, which is what a bunch of other people saw. So the people who refused to go in, they got pulled aside and they were shot, executed summarily, like instantly, like that, right? Because they're displaying their cowardice. So they weren't even tried or anything. Unless the time stopped, they were all taken into the phantom zone, and then they all were tried and then guilty of treason or cowardice and then executed. I'd like to argue, personally, no. I don't think soldiers really do have a free will, because they're ordered to do things. People who are ordered to do things do not have free will, because it's an order, it's not a choice. Having choice is having free will. Not being given an order. If you refuse to give an order, there's a consequence to that. The only consequence of making a choice is consequences that you would often see that's not really anything super significant, depending on what the situation is. It's not so as significant as something like death, you know what I mean? Or imprisonment, which is essentially you being enslaved. A choice would be whether or not you want to go see a movie or you want to go to dinner. Something that's not a choice, it's whether or not you want to go to war and maybe die, or maybe you want to just die for sure. That's not really a choice. Just like how, let's say you're at a job and your boss tells you, hey, I need you to do this for me, and you say no, then he kind of has grounds to fire you because you're refusing to do your work. Subscribe to the Shade Cinema Podcast, motherfuckers. Do it now. Now I'm going to discuss my opinion on the movie. It's honestly, I'm going to be very honest, very, very honest. This might shock a bunch of you, but I think this is probably my favorite war movie. This probably trumps Downfall in terms of a war movie, because it's more about the war. It's less about the drama behind the scenes. As fun as Downfall is, it's less about the war, more about how the war affects Hitler. It's more about the soldier himself. And I find that that's much more interesting. And it's a perspective that's not really that's not often very given. And you can say that Downfall as well is sort of like an anti-war movie, but it's to a lesser extent. And I really like the presentation, the cinematography, the ambiance, the shots. Oh my god, almost everything about the movie is absolutely 100% perfect. It has to be on like everyone's like top 10 easily. Yes, it's in German, and if you are going to watch it, and if you haven't seen it, watch it in German. If you have seen it but watched it in English, watch it in German, because in English it's kind of weird because everyone speaks English and you're seeing Germans. You know, it's better if it's like, because the Germans are going to speak German and the French are going to speak French, and it's accurate. It's much more immersive to the story, and the actors are amazing as well. One of the politicians actually played in Inglourious Basterds. He was the sniper in the movie, and that was a really good movie as well, and we might do a show on that, so keep that in mind. If I were to give it a rating, I'd probably give it like a 9.3, 9.4. I think one of the things that really detracts it for me is some of the things with like the depictions of the battles. Like there's instances where the Germans just have their guns over the parapet, which is like the part of the trench that's the wall between the trench itself and no man's land. They just have their guns sticking out like this, and you're like, why are they like that? They're just going to get sniped. Also, when the tanks showed up, they didn't have any weapons to destroy the tanks except for grenades, even though at that point they all knew what to do with when a tank showed up. But maybe that sector didn't fucking see tanks. I don't fucking know. But overall, very, 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 very good movie. I would suggest this to absolutely everyone. Up there with Hacksaw Ridge, up there with Saving Private Ryan, up there with Downfall, up there with Band of Brothers, up there with the German version of Band of Brothers, which is also really good. It's called Generation War, or in German it's called Our Mothers, Our Fathers, I think. One final thing I'd like to add is that Paul wasn't, his death, despite the fact that his death was peaceful and whatever, it was still seen as some form of statistic. Although his tag was not collected, he still died like as if he was some form of statistic. So if you don't know what dog tags generally are for, you take the dog tags to identify the dead, and then like you pick it out. You can then collect it and then bring it over to an officer in whatever informational battalion that you have, and they'll be able to count it and then say, oh, this person is KIA or whatever. He was killed in action. The deaths all in this movie were all very statistical. You learn about these big battles, right? Like Stalingrad. You learn about let's say in World War One, Verdun, the Somme. You hear 300,000 people killed, 400,000 people killed, 100,000 people killed, whatever. And you don't think of the individual people, but the reality is that every single one of those people were individuals with lives, with families, with things that they loved, things that they hated, with their favorite dishes, their favorite meals, whatever the case may be. They had all this stuff already. And they were, at the end of the day, deprived of that. They didn't have that at the end of the day anymore after they died. And they unfortunately became a statistic and were not treated as people by the end of it all. So if you enjoyed that show, leave a like, subscribe to the channel.
Subscribe to the Shade Cinema Podcast, motherfuckers. Do it now.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. It's a bit different, obviously, because we're not as many people. Obviously, it's just me. I personally like the solo format. It's interesting. It's different. It's kind of like a monologue, but I can't do this for obviously every single episode, but it's fun, like it's different. But the next episode is going to be a big one. It's going to be based on a show that's, concurrent at this moment. It's going to be very exciting.
I don't like sand.
So thank you guys for watching, and a final message from our good friend Drake.
I want you all to subscribe to the Shade Cinema Podcast. And don't forget to hit the like button, or I'm going to post hentai to my story again.